The Last Battalion, a Sci-Fi Story. The Earth had once been a cradle of civilization, a small blue jewel in the vast expanse of the Milky Way. The United States Marines had stood as one of its mightiest forces, their reputation echoing across every continent. They were warriors, tempered in battle and molded by discipline, always ready to face any challenge, no matter how insurmountable. But that was before the sun, Earth's heart, grew unstable. It started with warnings, unexplained solar flares that began to scorch the planet, turning once fertile lands into barren wastelands. The Earth's magnetic shield weakened, and solar radiation began to tear apart ecosystems. Within years, the skies turned red, crops withered, and oceans boiled under the sun's unbearable heat. Desperation set in. Humanity had nowhere to go. They tried to escape to Mars, but it was too late. The planet's surface became inhospitable. The oceans evaporated, and airless storms ravaged the land. The United States was the first to leave, a last-ditch effort to ensure survival. They commandeered all available spacecraft, and with the best of their resources, fled into the unknown void of space. In the face of extinction, the remaining few nations that could still muster power pooled together. The Marines led the charge, as they always had, but they did so knowing they would never return to Earth again. They left the Milky Way, setting their course toward the Andromeda Galaxy, leaving behind their home, their history, and their legacy. 1,000 years passed in the galaxy without humanity's touch. Alien civilizations, once teetering on the brink of collapse, had now found a strange stability. Trade routes flourished, culture blossomed, and war became a distant memory. The major galactic powers, Sirians, Zoralths, and the Trivak, formed fragile alliances that kept the peace. Yet peace, in its own way, began to rot from within. The Trivak, once fierce and territorial, now spent centuries contemplating philosophy. The Zoralths, known for their brutal conquests, had given up their warlike ways for science and exploration. The Shirians, a race of massive cerebral beings, led the way in diplomacy and intellectual pursuits. But with peace came stagnation, and with stagnation came decay. Civilization became bloated, indulgent. The warriors of old were revered, but grew out of touch with the harsh realities of survival. The Trivak, once feared for their relentless drive, now filled their days with long debates over ethics rather than battle strategy. The Zoralths, once the scourge of the galaxy, had allowed their warrior class to fade into history. The Shirians sought knowledge, but without any reason to fight, they had lost the edge that had once made them great. As the galaxy grew complacent, smaller, more aggressive factions began to stir. They attacked without provocation, eager to seize the luxuries that the peaceful empire had left unguarded. Civil wars broke out across the stars, and the galaxy spiraled into total chaos. Every race struggled to maintain order, but they were too far gone. The peace they had worked so hard to build was crumbling. Chapter 3: The Search for Warriors. In the chaos of war, there were whispers of one race that had once fought with unmatched ferocity: humans. The stories of their warriors, the United States Marines, became legend among the few remaining historians. The Marines were said to be a force capable of defeating enemies 10 to 1. They were said to have fought on planets ravaged by starvation and plague, enduring horrors that would break lesser beings. And in that era of war, the galaxy needed them more than ever. It was the Zoralth Council that first decided to search the archives. The ancient records of the United States Marines were filled with stories of heroism and military genius, but they also spoke of one other thing: hope. Hope that the galaxy could be saved. But the humans were gone. They had left the Milky Way, vanishing into the dark abyss of space. In an act of desperation, the surviving leaders turned to the greatest minds of the galaxy, beings who had mastered time travel but had never dared to use it. They needed to go back. They needed the Marines, and they needed them now. The leaders of the Zoralths and their allies formed a coalition, one last desperate attempt to save the galaxy. The remnants of their advanced civilization, desperate in their desperation, sought a solution buried deep within their archives: the United States Marines. They had once been more than just soldiers. They were legends, warriors capable of defeating enemies that outnumbered them 10 to 1. But they were gone, vanished from the Milky Way, the last of their kind fleeing to the unknown regions of the cosmos. Time travel was an impossible concept for most, but the ancient scholars of the galaxy had unlocked the secrets of time long ago. However, they had never dared to use it, until now. The Zoralth Council, along with the remaining power brokers of the galaxy, realized they needed not just a single Marine but an entire battalion. If the galaxy were to stand any chance against the forces that threatened to tear it apart, they needed the unparalleled tactical genius, discipline, and might of humanity's finest warriors. For months, alien engineers and scientists worked tirelessly, constructing a device capable of breaching the temporal veil. It was a massive contraption, intricate and glowing with alien energy, designed to reach back in time to the year 2025, the moment when the last of humanity's warriors had boarded their ships and left Earth behind. The plan was simple: retrieve an entire Marine battalion, those who had endured humanity's darkest hours and were capable of taking on forces that outnumbered them. They would need not one, but 100, 1,000 Marines, ready to fight in a galaxy that was unraveling at the seams. In the final days of preparation, the alien coalition debated how to choose which Marines to bring back. They knew that they could not simply rely on technology to recreate what made the Marines unique. They needed the actual soldiers, their experiences, their minds, and their abilities intact. Each Marine was selected not just for their combat prowess, but for their leadership, their spirit, and their unwavering sense of duty. This battalion had faced extinction itself. They were the last remnants of humanity's ability to survive when all seemed lost. They were the epitome of resilience. The device was powered up and ready for activation. The coalition had selected a specific group of Marines from the final battle on Earth, those who had fought for survival against the dying sun, those who had stayed behind to make sure the last remnants of humanity would escape, and those who had turned the tide on battles that had seemed impossible. They would return to the future with the strength of the United States Marine Corps at their backs. The plan was set in motion. As the device hummed to life, a surge of energy wrapped around the battalion of Marines. Time itself began to stretch and distort as the very fabric of reality tore open before them. In an instant, the battlefield of Earth vanished, and the Marines were pulled into the great unknown of the future. When Sergeant Jack Horn and his battalion of Marines opened their eyes, they were no longer on the dying world of Earth. They stood in a vast alien spaceship, surrounded by strange faces. Alien leaders, Zoralths, Trivak, and Shirians, looked upon them with a mixture of awe and desperation. The Marines, disoriented but ever vigilant, immediately fell into formation. It was instinct, years of combat, of brotherhood, of facing the impossible together. They didn't need to understand what had happened. They were here, and their mission remained unchanged: to fight. Sergeant Horn, a seasoned Marine with a deep sense of duty, was the first to speak. His voice was gruff, a reflection of the countless battles he had fought. "Where are we?" he asked. Though it didn't matter. He had never been one to question orders. The answer would come soon enough. The Zoralth Council's leader, a towering figure with translucent skin that glowed faintly, stepped forward. "You have been brought here to save the galaxy. It is in turmoil, teetering on the brink of annihilation. Your kind, your Marines, are the only hope we have." Horn's eyes narrowed. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. But he stood tall, his Marines standing in silent formation behind him. "We're here to do one thing: fight. Tell us who the enemy is and we'll handle the rest." The Zoralth leader gestured toward the viewscreen. The image revealed a galaxy consumed by war, planets burning, fleets clashing, and civilizations crumbling. An army of marauding invaders, led by the bloodthirsty Vrikans, had swept across the stars, leaving devastation in their wake. The galaxy's once proud empires had been broken, and only a handful of civilizations were left to stand against them. "These are the Vrikans," the Zoralth leader explained. "They are the ones who will bring an end to everything. We've lost too much time already. We need you to help us. Bring back the spirit of battle. Only the Marines can do that." Horn surveyed his battalion. These were the best of humanity's finest, their training honed through years of service and warfare. He could see the same determination in their eyes that he carried in his own. They had been brought here for a reason, and they would not fail. All right, Horn said, his voice filled with resolve. We're not here to be saviors. We're here to win. It's what we do. The battalion nodded in unison, the bond of brotherhood unshaken by the strange circumstances. These Marines had been chosen for their unbreakable spirit, their tactical brilliance, and their ability to adapt to any challenge. They were here to fight, to lead, and to take back the galaxy, one battle at a time. The Marines of Earth, fresh from the past, were ready. They were a force unlike any other, prepared to face an enemy that had never known defeat. As they took their first steps onto alien soil, they could feel the weight of the mission ahead. The galaxy was at war, and humanity's last battalion would stand at the front lines, ready to do what no other force could. The battle had begun. After being briefed on the dire situation the galaxy faced, Sergeant Horn and his battalion began the long process of adapting to this new and unfamiliar war. While the Marines were undoubtedly formidable, their training and techniques were steeped in the tools and tactics of their time, tools that were now useless in a galaxy filled with advanced alien technologies. The weapons they had brought with them had been left behind on the dying world of Earth. They were now faced with the challenge of finding and adapting new weapons for a conflict they had no knowledge of, but they were not ones to back down from a challenge. The Zoralths, in their desperation, provided the Marines with an array of weapons, most of them derived from the most advanced technology of their time. They handed over sleek, glowing energy rifles, plasma pistols, and kinetic disruptors, devices that, to the untrained eye, would have appeared overwhelmingly powerful. These weapons were capable of disintegrating entire structures with a single shot, rendering conventional ballistic systems obsolete. However, the Marines were not impressed. These might look fancy, Horn muttered as he held one of the energy rifles, running his hand over its smooth surface, but they're not going to cut it. I don't care how advanced they are. We need something we can trust in close combat. Captain Simmons, one of the battalion's senior officers, ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. They're too clean, too perfect. There's no soul in them. We need something with grit, something we can rely on when things go sideways. It was true. The Marines were masters of close-quarter combat. No amount of advanced technology could replace the brutal effectiveness of hand-to-hand tactics, the precision of a well-placed knife thrust, or the lethal power of a bayonet charge. But the tools at their disposal, though undeniably effective from a distance, lacked the kind of personal touch that was woven into every Marine's soul. It was time for the Marines to make their weapons their own. Horn gathered his battalion in the makeshift weaponry workshop on the alien ship, a cavernous room lined with advanced equipment that hummed with energy. A dozen engineers, mostly Jarians and Trivac, milled around preparing to assist. These alien beings had never seen anything like a Marine weapon before, and they were eager to learn. "All right," Horn said, looking over his Marines. "Here's the plan. We're going to take these fancy toys and turn them into what we know. We'll adapt them for our combat style. They won't just fight for us, they'll fight with us. We'll make them personal." Simmons nodded. "That's right. We'll give these rifles the kick they need. I'm not trusting some energy beam to hold up when we're surrounded by 6 Vrikans. I want something that stays in my hands." The first step was the energy rifles. While these weapons had impressive range and accuracy, they were not designed for the kind of savage, up-close brawls the Marines were used to. The Marines tore apart the guns and replaced some components with their own modifications. Reinforced grips for better handling, retractable blades that could extend from the barrel to turn the weapon into a close combat spear. But that wasn't enough. The Jarians, with their delicate touch, had designed an elegant piece of alien tech, a high-powered plasma blade that could slice through nearly anything. To the Marines, it was a start, but it lacked the signature finesse of a traditional weapon. "We're Marines, not swordsmen," said Sergeant Blake, one of the younger members of the battalion. "We fight with precision. This blade won't do, but it gives me an idea." With a smile, Blake started crafting, taking the plasma blade and adding an extra feature, a folding, curved blade that could be mounted on the rifle's underbarrel. It was a simple, brutal addition, a melee weapon with the cutting power of the plasma blade, but the feel of something familiar. The final touch, a standard bayonet fitting, an absurd throwback to old-school infantry tactics. "Now that's a real Marine's weapon," Blake grinned, admiring his work as the bayonet locked into place with a satisfying click. The bayonet was not just a joke to the Marines. It was a symbol. A symbol of everything that made them who they were, the unrelenting, unstoppable force, even in the most hopeless of circumstances. The next day, the battalion stood in the training area, a vast, simulated battlefield on the alien ship. The Zoralth engineers had created a holographic environment where the Marines could test their new weapons in simulated combat. They would face off against virtual representations of the Vrikans, enemy forces they had only just begun to understand. The Marines lined up, each holding their newly modified energy rifles, now equipped with bayonets and plasma blades. They were ready for anything. Horn's voice cut through the air. "Let's show them what we can do." The holographic battlefield sprang to life around them, a simulated alien city filled with towering structures and narrow alleyways. Suddenly, the Vrikans materialized in front of them, beasts of war, with massive, muscled bodies and battle-hardened minds. As the first Vrikan charged, Horn instinctively swung his rifle to his shoulder, the energy blast disintegrating the alien's chest in a flash of light. But as more charged forward, the Marines closed the distance, bringing their rifles to bear in hand-to-hand combat. The bayonets were quick and brutal, slashing through alien flesh with terrifying efficiency. They fought like true Marines, adapting to the enemy's moves, turning each kill into a calculated act of brutality. The plasma blades hummed, cutting through armor and bone alike. When the enemies got too close, the Marines transitioned seamlessly, using the bayonets as tools of death in confined spaces. They showed the Vrikans what it meant to fight like they had on Earth. There was no escape from the Marines' fury. Captain Simmons swung his rifle around, plunging the bayonet into a Vrikan's throat with a smirk. "Didn't know these new toys could feel so good," he said, wiping blood from his face. "Doesn't matter how shiny their tech is," Horn replied, his voice hard as steel. "The Marines have always known the best weapon is the one that gets the job done." The battle simulation ended with the Marines standing victorious. The alien engineers who had watched in awe had to admit there was something primal, something deadly in the way the Marines fought. It was clear the weapons they had been given were no match for the ingenuity of Earth's warriors. As the Marines prepared for the real war ahead, they took a moment to reflect on what they had done. The bayonets were a joke, sure, but they also served as a reminder, no matter how far humanity had come, no matter how advanced the technology, the Marines would always carry with them the grit and ferocity of those first days of battle. Blake, wiping sweat from his brow, looked at his rifle with the bayonet attached and chuckled. "You think they'll get the joke when we use these in the real fight?" Horn smirked. "We'll see. But you know what? When the Vrikans are lying dead at our feet, I doubt anyone will be asking about the bayonets." The laughter that rippled through the battalion was fleeting, but it carried something deeper. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the Marines could find strength in humor. And when the battle came, they would fight with every weapon at their disposal, whether it was a plasma rifle, a bayonet, or their own blood-soaked fists. As the days passed aboard their flagship, the Marines settled into their new routine. They adapted to the alien technologies at their disposal and prepared for the battles ahead. But there was something deeply ingrained in every Marine, an intuitive understanding of combat, honed over decades of training and battlefield experience. It wasn't enough to simply use alien weapons. They needed to adapt their own strategies to the unique challenges of space combat. In the vacuum of space, traditional tactics didn't apply. There were no ground wars to rely on, no terrain to control. Combat would be fought in the dark void, in the hulls of starships and the expanses between planets. The Marines would need to bring something new to the table, something they could only begin to imagine. Sergeant Horn, ever the tactician, was the first to realize that their physical limitations could be solved by technology. They needed to fight in the void of space, where gravity and atmosphere were no longer in their favor. But what if they didn't have to rely on conventional suits? What if they could create something that made them stronger, faster, and more deadly? It was the Shirians who first showed them the rudimentary designs for powered exoskeletons, armor that could enhance strength and endurance. The Zoralths had created something similar for their own species, but it was too cumbersome for the Marines. They needed something sleek, agile, and deadly, something that would allow them to perform their ground tactics in space. But Horn had a vision. He looked at the designs and knew what had to be done. He called together his battalion and the top alien engineers. "We need a suit that makes us as deadly as we are on the ground," he said. "We need something that can be used in zero gravity, that allows us to leap from ship to ship, tear through enemy lines, and," he smirked, "keep us alive when things go wrong." The engineers were skeptical. The technology was advanced, but creating an armor that worked in both zero gravity and close-quarter combat was an unprecedented task. But the Marines had never been ones to accept limitations. They would bend the rules of possibility to suit their needs. Horn and his team pored over the designs for weeks, integrating the best of Earth's combat technologies with the alien innovations. They reinforced the exoskeletons with advanced alloys, ensuring the suits could withstand extreme temperatures and even the crushing pressures of a damaged starship. But that wasn't enough. The final touch was the addition of a heads-up display that connected directly to the Marines' neural interface. They wouldn't just see the battlefield, they would feel it. The HUD displayed targeting data, critical objectives, and even tactical feedback that enhanced a Marine's strategic awareness in real time. And then, of course, there was the armor's signature feature, the energy shield. It was an idea borrowed from the Zoralth's personal defense technology, but with a critical enhancement. The shields would only activate on command, giving the Marines total control. In the heat of battle, they could unleash an energy barrier strong enough to block plasma fire, allowing them to charge headlong into enemy lines without fear. But the true breakthrough came when the Marines insisted on one more feature, a feature considered impossible by most engineers: the ability to perform gravity-defying leaps. With the integration of a reverse thrust system and enhanced repulsor technology, each Marine could jump across the battlefield, vaulting from one location to another in defiance of gravity. They would not only fight with weapons, but with the very fabric of space itself. The Marines called it strike armor, in homage to the concept of launching themselves into hostile situations with the audacity only Marines could understand. Once the strike armor was ready, the Marines began to test it. The zero-gravity training fields aboard the alien ship were their first proving grounds. They launched themselves into the air, adjusting their thrusters, engaging their energy shields, and using their enhanced strength to tear through simulated enemy forces. Each Marine became a weapon of unimaginable power, an unstoppable force in the vacuum of space. The simulations quickly grew more advanced. No longer were the Marines restricted to merely avoiding enemy fire. They could now return fire with deadly precision, launching projectiles from their energy rifles while using their jetpacks to evade. They could now leap from ship to ship, board enemy vessels, and engage in close-quarters combat in the vacuum of space. They were no longer mere soldiers. They were Marines in the truest sense, always moving, always adapting. Horn saw potential in the new tactics they were developing. Space combat was about adaptability and precision, not brute force. With the new strike armor, the Marines could engage in hit-and-run tactics, using the void of space as their ally. They could strike the enemy where it hurt most, disorient them, and then disappear into the darkness of space, only to strike again when the time was right. "I've seen the future, and it's in our hands," Horn said to his battalion one evening, watching as the Marines tested the suits. "We've got the technology now. We don't just fight in the stars, we own them." The new combat strategies were a product of the Marines' unique combination of imagination, training, and relentless determination. No alien race had ever thought of using space combat in such an intimate, tactical way. The Zoralths had their advanced technology, but it was designed for defense, not warfare. The Trivak were fierce, but they had no experience in the nuances of space combat. The Marines, however, had been fighting on the front lines of warfare for centuries. They had fought with nothing but their own willpower, their own grit, and now they had something far more powerful: the tools to make their tactics a reality. Using their strike armor, the Marines began to adapt their strategies to the unpredictable nature of space. They integrated sudden bursts of speed into their offensive tactics, using the armor's thrusters to move faster than any enemy could track. They utilized their energy shields not just for defense, but as a tool to disrupt enemy fire and close the gap between them and their targets. They would use the environment, asteroids, space debris, and enemy ships, as both cover and weapons in themselves. Soon, they developed what they called tactical drops. These were surprise assaults on enemy ships, where Marines would be dropped into enemy vessels through a combination of jumps, thrusters, and precise targeting. They would use the tight confines of enemy ships to their advantage, clearing out corridors with quick, brutal efficiency. And when they emerged, they would be an unstoppable wave of death. It was a new era of warfare, one that none of the galaxy's old empires could predict. The Marines were here to rewrite the rules of space combat, to take everything that had once been considered impossible and make it their own. And the Vrikkans? They were about to find out what happened when humanity's finest were given the power to fight in the stars. Time was running out. The Vrikkans' campaign had already ravaged the galaxy, and the war was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. The last remnants of the peaceful empires were unable to stem the tide of destruction. Entire worlds had fallen, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. As much as they had hoped to stop the Vrikkans, it had become clear the galaxy was losing. Humanity's last hope, the Marine Battalion in their strike armor, was the only force capable of changing the outcome. Sergeant Horn paced the command center aboard their flagship, scanning the incoming reports on the HUD of his helmet. His battalion had gone through trial after trial, their new tactics proving lethal against enemy forces. Yet nothing had prepared them for the war they were about to face. They had spent weeks preparing for the inevitable, and now it was time to fight. "Sergeant," Captain Simmons called from the control panel, "we just received intel from the Zoralths. The Vrikkans are making their move on Kelnar 4. It's a pre-industrial world, an agrarian planet, completely unprepared for war. They're about to be wiped out." Horn clenched his fists. "Not on my watch." Kelnar 4 was an untouched, peaceful world. Its people had never known the horrors of intergalactic war. Their cities were built from stone and wood, and their farms stretched across lush green fields. The people of Kelnar 4 were innocent, oblivious to the galaxy-wide conflict. They had not even reached the stars, yet now they were about to face total annihilation. The Marines knew that they could not let this world fall. If they did, it would be more than just another world lost. It would send a message to every other civilization in the galaxy that no one was safe. They would have to act quickly, decisively, and with a level of precision that no one expected from such a small battalion. The strike armor's thrusters hummed to life as the Marines prepared for their first real mission. The atmosphere aboard the ship was tense, but there was no hesitation in the Marines' movements. Each Marine checked their gear one final time: plasma rifles, plasma blades, energy shields, and of course their bayonets, which had now become a symbol of their irreverent spirit and deadly efficiency. Horn stood at the head of the formation, scanning the mission data on his helmet's display. "Listen up," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're going in fast, no time to waste. The Vrikkans have already begun their attack on Kelnar 4. We'll drop in hot, eliminate the invaders, and get these people to safety. We are their last hope, Marines. Do it right." Simmons, ever the strategist, stepped up next to him. "Remember, the Kelnarians aren't soldiers. They don't have weapons, and they don't understand the stakes. We can't just go in guns blazing. We need to protect the civilians while cutting down the Vrikkans." The ship's comms buzzed, and the voice of the Zoralth leader came over the radio. "We are scanning for Vrikkan ships in the area. We estimate that a fleet of at least 3 warships is preparing to destroy the planet's central city. The Kelnarians have no defense. Your mission is to stop the bombing and eliminate all Vrikkan forces before they can carry out their massacre." Horn nodded. "Understood. Let's get this done." With a sudden jolt, the ship's drop pods were launched, each one carrying a Marine Battalion member. The pods cut through the atmosphere like missiles, heating up as they plunged toward Kelnar 4's surface. The Marines, now encased in their strike armor, felt the sudden pressure of the atmosphere against their shields, but it was nothing they couldn't handle. These warriors had been forged for moments like this. Kelnar 4's surface began to materialize below them, a sprawling green landscape dotted with vast fields of crops, small settlements, and the sprawling capital city in the distance. It was a world of tranquility, a world that had never known war. But that was about to change. The Marines hit the surface with a resounding impact, their thrusters firing at the last moment to soften their landing. Dust and debris scattered in all directions as the drop pods embedded themselves into the ground. The Marines wasted no time in disembarking. "Move out, Marines," Horn ordered, the voice in his helmet steady as the team formed up, ready for action. The world around them was peaceful, but the unmistakable signs of an impending invasion were clear. The sky was darkened by the smoke of distant fires, and the faint rumble of explosions echoed in the distance. The Vrikkans were already on the move. The Marines moved through the agricultural fields, their advanced armor making no sound as they moved with deadly precision. Horn took the lead, his rifle raised and ready. The Kelnarians were unaware of the horrors that were about to befall them, but the Marines would change that. They would protect this world at all costs. As they approached a small settlement on the outskirts of the city, the first wave of Vrikkans appeared. Massive, armored figures with dark, menacing eyes and an air of utter brutality. They had begun to round up the Kelnarians, herding them into groups as they prepared for slaughter. Horn gave a quick hand signal. Engage at will. The Marines opened fire, their energy rifles sending brilliant pulses of light through the air. The Vrikkans fell one by one, their armor unable to withstand the power of the Marines' weapons. As the battle raged on, the Marines adapted to the terrain, using their thrusters to leap over obstacles and into enemy lines. Their bayonets were used with precision, tearing through Vrikkans as they closed the distance. The advanced strike armor allowed them to become unstoppable forces of destruction, their movements fluid and deadly. But it wasn't just about eliminating the enemy. It was about saving the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Sergeant Blake and Corporal Reyes worked together to evacuate Kelnarian families, using the tactical drops to create a safe path through the chaos. They shielded civilians from enemy fire, using their energy shields to absorb plasma blasts and create safe corridors for escape. With each passing minute, the tide of battle shifted. The Vrikkans began to realize they were outmatched, their once overwhelming numbers now a liability against the Marines' superior tactics and technology. The Kelnarians, though initially frightened, began to fight back with whatever tools they could find. They took up arms under the Marines' guidance, joining the fray in whatever way they could. Horn, scanning the battlefield, saw the Vrikkan command ship preparing to launch its final assault on the planet's capital. The moment had come. "Let's finish this," Horn said, gritting his teeth. "Marines, on me. We're taking down that ship." With precision only the Marines could achieve, they advanced toward the Vrikkan command ship. Their strike suits allowed them to leap across the battlefield, and with energy shields activated, they crashed through enemy lines with overwhelming force. As they reached the ship, they fought their way through the outer defenses, using explosives and tactical breaching to tear through the Vrikkans' last line of defense. When they finally reached the command center, Horn planted explosives on the ship's core, triggering a massive explosion that sent shockwaves through the battlefield. With the Vrikkans defeated, the Marines stood victorious on Kelnar 4. The planet had been saved, thanks to their arrival in time to stop the massacre. In the aftermath of the battle, the Marines helped the Kelnarians rebuild. Though they had saved the planet, it was clear that Kelnar 4 would never be the same. The Kelnarians would have to adapt to the knowledge of war, but they would do so under the protection of their new allies, humanity's Last Battalion. As the Marines surveyed the battlefield, their hearts were heavy. They had saved the Kelnarians, but they had also been reminded of the painful truth they had tried to avoid. Humanity, as they had once known it, was gone. The Earth, their home, was a distant memory. No one would ever return to the world they had fought for, the the world they had loved. It was a crushing thought, but the Marines could not afford to dwell on it. The galaxy was still at war, and their fight was far from over. Horn stood alone on a hill overlooking the Kelnarian city, watching as the people rebuilt their homes and lives. He couldn't help but feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Earth had died. There was no going back. Humanity was gone, and with it, everything they had fought for. But despite the hollow ache in his chest, he stood tall. "Sir," Captain Simmons said, walking up beside him, "we did it. We saved them." Horn nodded slowly. "Yeah, we did. But the real question is, what now?" Simmons looked out over the Kelnarians, then back at Horn. "We fight, that's what we've always done. It's what we do now." Horn sighed, taking in the peaceful view before him. "I know, but sometimes I wonder if we're doing this for them or for us. We've lost everything. Earth's gone, humanity's gone, but we can't stop fighting, can we?" Simmons didn't respond immediately. "No, sir, we can't. We fight for what's left, because it's all we have. And maybe, just maybe, if we win, there will be something worth coming back for." Horn nodded, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the horizon. "We're the last of humanity, Captain. We can't turn back now. We owe it to Earth and to ourselves to finish this, to make sure what we've lost wasn't in vain." The two Marines stood in silence, watching as the Kelnarians celebrated their survival. Despite the overwhelming sorrow they felt, they knew one thing: they would never leave. They would fight until their last breath, not just for their fallen world, but for the future of all the worlds that still stood. And in the end, they would carry humanity's legacy on their shoulders, even if that meant being the last of their kind. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were the last hope of a dying galaxy, and they would never let that light go out. Chapter 14. The Fear That Followed. The first signs of fear came when the Vrikan fleet, cornered near the shattered remains of the Valtus system, hesitated to make a direct assault on a Marine-held world. Their commanders, once confident in their overwhelming superiority, began to question their strategy. The Vrikans had never faced a force like this before, an enemy who was relentless, adaptable, and most importantly, unafraid. They had come to understand something that shook the very core of the Vrikan Empire. The Marines were not afraid of death, and that terrified them. The Vrikans had prided themselves on their sheer power, their ability to crush entire worlds under the weight of their fleets. But the Marines had taken their battles to the ground, to the very heart of their invasions, infiltrating ships, destroying war factories, and taking down command centers with surgical precision. The Vrikans' advanced technology, their towering warships and impenetrable fortresses, had been shown to be no match for the brutal tactics the Marines employed. Horn stood in the command center, watching the data stream across his helmet's HUD. There was a noticeable change in the Vrikan fleet's movements. Their warships were no longer charging into battles with the same overwhelming force. They were beginning to pull back, regrouping more often than they attacked. Simmons, ever perceptive, spoke up. "They're starting to fear us. I've been tracking their communications. There's a shift in their tone. They're not as confident as they were a few weeks ago." "Good," Horn replied, his voice cold but determined. "That means they're finally starting to understand what we're capable of." But Horn wasn't so sure. He'd seen fear on the battlefield. He'd seen soldiers break under pressure, seen men run from the inevitable. But he had never seen fear in an enemy like this before. The Vrikans had no history of retreating, no memory of doubt. Their entire empire was built on domination and conquest. To see them faltering was unsettling. The battles continued, the carnage mounting. But as the Vrikans retreated, the cost of victory became increasingly apparent. It wasn't just the loss of soldiers like Reyes and Blake. The emotional toll was beginning to weigh heavily on the Marines. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far deeper. The losses on the battlefield were painful, but they weren't the only kind of loss the Marines faced. The loss of Earth, of everything they had once known, lingered like a shadow over them all. Every victory, no matter how hard won, felt hollow. They fought, not just for their fallen comrades, but for the memory of a world they would never see again. Private Matthews, a quiet and introspective member of the battalion, had been one of the first to speak of this grief. After a brutal skirmish on a Vrikan-held moon, where they had taken down an entire enemy battalion, Matthews had been found staring at the stars. When Horn approached him, he spoke softly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "Sir," Matthews said, his eyes never leaving the stars, "sometimes I wonder why we're still doing this. We've lost everything, Earth, our families. What are we fighting for anymore?" Horn stood beside him, looking up at the same stars. "We're fighting because we're still here. And while we're here, we fight for what's left, for every world we can save, for every innocent we can protect, for the future that still has a chance." Matthews nodded, but the weight of his words remained. The Marines had no answers for what they had lost, no way to bring back Earth, no way to heal the wounds that had been carved into their souls. But they could keep fighting, and so they did. As the months passed, the Marines found that their tactics were evolving. The Vrikans, once a well-oiled machine of destruction, had begun to break down. They still had power, still commanded massive fleets, but the Marines had figured them out. The Vrikans' over-reliance on brute force had become their weakness. The Marines knew how to strike at the heart of their war machine, and now the Vrikans were forced to play defense. They were reacting instead of acting, and the Marines had turned that shift to their advantage. The Vrikan fear spread to their soldiers on the ground as well. The first few encounters in the dense jungles of a moon orbiting one of the outer planets were evidence of this. The Marines had infiltrated deep into enemy territory, using stealth and surprise attacks to break their lines. The Vrikans, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies, were now beginning to hesitate at every corner, unsure of what lay in the darkness. In one such battle, the Marines cornered a squad of Vrikan soldiers in a canyon. The Vrikans had never seen such ferocity. How could they? Humans, once thought of as insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy, had become something far worse than they had ever expected. The fear was palpable. The Marines' charge, fueled by the ghosts of the past and the fury of the present, had become an unstoppable force. And as the Marines made their final assault on the Vrikan command ship, they could feel it. Each shot, each movement, sent waves of panic rippling through the enemy. Sergeant Horn looked around at his battalion, his heart heavy with the realization. They were winning, but not without a price. The Vrikans were breaking, yes, but the toll on the Marines had been great. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the last of humanity's will to fight, carrying on a legacy of resistance in a galaxy that had long forgotten what it meant to stand against the darkness. "The enemy's afraid of us," Horn said quietly, his voice like iron. "But we've paid for that fear with everything we've got. Don't ever forget what we've lost. We fight not just for victory, but for the memory of those who never got to see this moment." With each victory, the Vrikans faltered more. Their great empire, once unbeatable, was now crumbling under the pressure of the Marines' unyielding resistance. But as they approached the final push, the final battle to liberate the galaxy, Horn knew that the true victory lay in something deeper than just the fall of an empire. The Marines had fought with everything they had, but it was their resolve, their refusal to surrender, that had become their greatest weapon. And in that resolve, the Vrikans had found something they could not defeat. Fear, a force that could turn even the most ruthless conqueror into a shadow of their former self. But Horn also understood something else. This fight was far from over. As long as the Marines stood, they would fight, and they would never stop fighting, no matter the cost. The war wasn't just for the future of the galaxy. It was a fight for what remained of humanity's spirit, for the blood and sweat of those who had come before them, and for the future that had yet to be written. The Marines had nothing left but each other, and in that they found their strength. The war was not yet over, but the tide had finally turned. After months of relentless fighting, the Vrikans had retreated, leaving behind the scars of their conquest. The galaxy, once teetering on the edge of destruction, now had a glimmer of hope, thanks to humanity's Last Battalion. The Marines stood victorious, but their mission had changed. They weren't just fighting to defend one world or one species anymore. They had become the symbol of a new hope, a hope that the galaxy could be united, that the power of will and determination could turn the tide even in the face of overwhelming odds. But with this new hope came a new challenge. The war had fractured the galaxy into a dozen pieces, and while the Vrikans were defeated, their legacy of destruction lingered. Many of the galaxy's peaceful species, those who had once been part of the Council, had found themselves scattered, their unity shattered. The idea of rebuilding, of forging a new future, seemed daunting. And that was where the Marines came in. It wasn't just enough to fight anymore. The Marines had become a new kind of force, one that would rebuild what had been broken. They would train, mentor, and integrate the alien species into the Marine way. The strength, discipline, and tactical ingenuity that had made humanity such a force in the galaxy would now be passed on to others. Sergeant Horn stood at the front of a new training facility, built on one of the last surviving moons in the Kelnar system. The new recruits weren't just humans, they were Kelnarians, Trivak, Zirians, and even some Zoralths, species that had once been isolated in their ways of peace and diplomacy. Now, they stood together, ready to fight as one. Horn had thought about Earth every day since the war had started. The loss was a wound that would never heal. But here, in this training ground, something new was beginning to grow, something that could reshape the future. The training grounds were nothing like the peaceful fields of Kelnar IV. They were harsh, unforgiving. The Marine way was no easy path. It was about discipline, sacrifice, and the will to push through every obstacle, even when the odds seemed impossible. And now, Horn and his battalion had the daunting task of instilling that very spirit in species who had never known the true face of war. The first day of training began with a harsh reality check. The newly assembled recruits stood before the Marines, unsure of what to expect. Some were eager to prove themselves, while others still held on to their old ways: pacifism, diplomacy, the avoidance of violence at all costs. "We're not here to make you soldiers," Horn said, his voice booming across the training yard. "We're here to make you fighters. You will learn to adapt to the battlefield, to survive when everything else falls apart. You will be Marines. That's the only way you'll make it through this war." Simmons, standing beside him, spoke next. "The Marines have one rule: adapt and overcome. Every challenge, every obstacle, every enemy is something to be defeated, but only if you learn how to push beyond your limits. You will fail, and when you do, you'll learn how to get back up. That's what being a Marine is all about." The first lesson was simple: survival. They weren't going to teach the aliens how to fight with weapons. They were going to teach them how to fight with themselves. The Marines had always been about self-reliance, discipline, and trust in each other. But now they had to show that these principles could be applied across the galaxy, no matter the species. The first test for the recruits was a series of grueling obstacle courses designed to test their physical limits. Kelnarians, despite their peaceful nature, were surprisingly agile and strong. Trivak, with their brutal upbringing, proved resilient in the face of hardship. Shirians, though cerebral and strategic, learned quickly how to adapt to the chaotic unpredictability of combat. It was the Zoralths, however, who struggled the most. Their towering regal forms had made them respected diplomats, but in combat they were slow and unwieldy. They had never been taught to fight, not in the way the Marines understood it. Horn noticed this early on and decided to take a different approach with them. "Commander Zoralth," Horn called, as the leader of the Zoralths, a proud being named Tekalan, struggled to scale the obstacle course. "You're holding back. You're thinking too much. Stop trying to be graceful. Move. That's what it takes to survive." Tekalan, though clearly frustrated, took Horn's words to heart. For the first time in his life, he threw caution to the wind and pushed himself beyond his comfort zone. He faltered at first, stumbling, but Horn could see the shift. The Zoralth had begun to understand. This wasn't just about winning, it was about fighting to survive. And that, he realized, was something he could learn. The first real test of the new unified battalion came sooner than expected. The Vrikan remnants had regrouped and were attempting to reassert their dominance in the galaxy. While the Marines had been training their new allies, the enemy was regrouping and preparing for another devastating offensive. This time, they would face a new kind of foe, a united front of species, each of them learning to fight like Marines. Horn and Simmons briefed the battalion on the mission ahead. They would be striking at the heart of the Vrikan war machine, a space station that served as their base of operations in the sector. The Vrikans had fortified the station with advanced defenses, but they had made one critical mistake. They underestimated the strength of their enemies. The battle would be fierce, but for the first time, the Marines were not alone. The Kelnarians, Trivak, Shirians, and Zoralths fought side by side, their skills forged in the fires of the Marines' training. The first wave of Marines led the charge, but the second wave, consisting of the newly trained recruits, joined in with relentless aggression. Captain Simmons, leading a squad of mixed species, stormed the outer perimeter of the station. "Form up," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Remember what we taught you. Stay tight, move fast, and make every shot count." The Marines moved with deadly precision, each species playing to its strengths. The Kelnarians, agile and fast, provided swift cover fire, while the Trivak charged headlong into enemy lines, their brute strength overwhelming anything in their path. The Jirians, with their advanced minds, acted as strategists, directing the Marines' movements from the rear. The Zoralths, though slow, used their immense size and power to breach enemy defenses, their shields deflecting the enemy's fire as they cleared paths for the others. Despite the odds, despite the Vrikan defenses, the unified force of Marines and their new allies managed to push through. The battle was intense, and there were losses along the way, but the Marines were relentless. Each alien species had adopted the Marine mindset: adapt, fight, and never give up. As the final Vrikan stronghold crumbled and the space station was overtaken, Horn stood among the wreckage, watching the triumphant faces of the newly forged battalion. For the first time since the fall of Earth, there was a sense of something that had been lost: unity. "Well, I'll be damned," Simmons said, clapping Horn on the back. "We did it." Horn looked out at the horizon, his expression serious, but not without hope. "We did. But this isn't just about fighting. It's about rebuilding. It's about showing the galaxy that no matter how much we've lost, we can still come together." For the first time, the Marines saw the future not as a battleground, but as a place for something greater, something worth fighting for. The galaxy had been fractured by war, but in the Marines' training, in their unity, there was the possibility of something new. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the foundation of a new hope. With the Vrikan threat eliminated, the task of rebuilding the galaxy began. The Marines, now not only warriors but mentors, worked to help their alien allies establish strongholds of peace, teaching them the importance of unity, discipline, and strength. They weren't just training soldiers. They were shaping the next generation of leaders who would carry the torch for a new era in the galaxy. Each species contributed in its own way, creating a vibrant new alliance that held the promise of peace, strength, and hope. The Kelnarians, once farmers, now stood as fierce defenders of their home. The Trivak, brutal but now tactically adept, became the backbone of the new military force. The Shirians, thinkers and strategists, helped build a new governance system. The Zoralths, once diplomats, became the ambassadors of the new peace, ensuring that every voice in the galaxy was heard. And at the heart of it all stood the Marines, humanity's last gift to the galaxy. They had lost everything, but in their sacrifice, they had built a legacy that would last. The galaxy would never forget what they had done, nor would it ever forget the spirit they had instilled in the new generations.